Hello, 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 and welcome to another episode of the Hilaritas Podcast, where we discuss the vast world of iconic writer, psychedelic psychologist, rebel philosopher, and self-proclaimed agnostic mystic, Robert Anton Wilson. A few things of note today. As this episode releases on the 23rd of July, I want to recognize Maybe Day and the extraordinary efforts of Bobby Campbell in what is now the 5th annual Maybe Day. Bobby has recently added Maybe Night, so you get the Finnegan's Wake along with the Ulysses. Head over to maybeday.net for this year's creative extravaganza. Secondly, Hilaritas has released a hardcover edition of Prometheus Rising. Check out the link in the show notes to purchase your copy of best-selling Robert Anton Wilson's Prometheus Rising. Today I have a guest host. Former guest of the pod, Zack West, will sit in as host this month and interview me on the 8th Circuit model of consciousness. What I need to do here, and I think I'm just gonna let you take it from here.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks for letting me do this. I was pretty excited about being able to talk about the 8 circuits with you. And I'd kind of like to start as far as like your history with like psychology and psychedelics, because I think
Okay.
one of the umbrellas that the 8 circuit model falls into is a psychological model that because it came through Timothy Leary, also has a psychedelic component to it. And so
Yeah.
how did you get into the psychological world?
Well, so I'll say, yeah, I would say that the 8 circuit model is an excellent melding of developmental and transpersonal psychology, and we can get into that later. But I, boy, what do I want to say here? I grew up with just an aptitude for math and science, and I was always on this engineering path, and but I also had this interest in psychology. Uh, I remember I was applying to Caltech as in high school. My college application, I was applying to Caltech, and I was applying to all engineering schools. I was going down an engineering path, but my application for Caltech had a lot of questions, and I remember I wish I'd kept it because I remember talking more about psychology maybe than math and science. And I remember in high school really having an interest in Timothy Leary that I cannot explain where that came from to this day. It just was on my radar. Psychedelics were on my radar, and for some reason just understood them to be something sacred from the get-go. And I don't know where that came from, but I remember that in high school. And then and when I was in engineering school in college, I started dabbling with psychedelics, and in particular through the Grateful Dead shows that I was going to at that time. And that really opened me up to what I would call Seventh Circuit experiences, just the connection with the crowd and the band and the environment. And and eventually, after a dozen years or so in my engineering career, I did quit that whole line of work and went to school, went back to grad school to become a psychotherapist. And I went to a weird little Buddhist university up in Boulder called Naropa University. It has an excellent experiential psychology program and really gets into the transpersonal. So I think that's maybe the gist of my answer for now. It's always kind of been this engineering world, this psychology world, and this psychedelic world, and how they all fit together. Most of my adult life trying to figure out how those all fit together.
That's cool. It seems like those are themes that I've always gravitated towards, especially with the Leary to Wilson connection. The engineering, the psychology, and the psychedelics. Like, I don't know what about those. It's like a trinity that I've like really gravitated towards as well. So you got into Timothy Leary first before Wilson.
Yeah, I remember. So we started dabbling with psychedelics in college and the Grateful Dead and reading all kinds of books. I remember reading books about various bands like Pink Floyd and Led Zeppelin and The Doors. But eventually, I remember that one of the first books I read was Timothy Leary's Flashbacks, which is just, I mean, it's a total ego book, but it's fun, fun, fun. And he just knew everybody and intermingled with everybody. And he introduces everybody in the book through, yeah, every chapter kind of has like a heading that highlights a different character from his life. And I remember he had a copy of the psychedelic experience and sort of using that to guide our sessions. But eventually, I think in the mid to late 90s, I was getting online more and more, and I found this website, deoxy.org, which apparently has been archived, is still available. And it was much more simpler when I found it. But it had Leary and Wilson on the same page. It had like a page for Alan Watts and John Lilly and Buddhism and McKenna. And it had Leary and Wilson on the same page. So by finding Leary, I found Wilson. But Wilson was too much for me at first. I remember it had like, Robert Anton Wilson, 1932 never. And then you click on never, and it gives you this thing about one of his pitches on immortality. And that was just too weird for me to wrap my head around. And I think, as I remember it, that I kind of diverged from Wilson and went down more of a McKenna rabbit hole for probably a while, but slowly kept creeping back to Wilson and wrapping my head around what he had to say, getting into his books, finding a bunch of his books at a used bookstore. And that deoxy website, I should put a link to that in the show notes, had a lot of stuff on the eighth circuit model. And that just really resonated with me. Other books I was reading was like Carlos Castaneda in the early 90s. And I got a copy of like John Lilly's Center of the Cyclone.
Mm.
And Lilly had his own like states of consciousness model. And there was some comparisons to that, to the eighth circuit model on the deoxy website. So slowly but surely, I opened up to Wilson and the Eighth Circuit model, and then probably in my 20s, it might have been mostly Leary and Ramdas and McKenna and folks like that. And then by the time I got into my 30s, I was just whole hog on Wilson.
Yeah, that's sort of me too. And as far as like when you first started getting into the eight circuit model, did it resonate really well with what you already knew about psychology?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I knew a whole lot about psychology at that time, but it did resonate with me. Um, I probably learned more about psychology through the Eighth Circuit model.
Mm.
And then when I went to grad school for psychotherapy, it was the fields of psychotherapy and psychology. To be frank, I think they're a mess. They're just um, dozens and dozens of modalities of psychotherapy and dozens of perspectives on psychology, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of consensus. But for me, the Eighth Circuit model became like this meta model, this skeleton, which I could hang these things on. And like, okay, well, that makes sense because it falls under what I think of as Circuit 3 and so on and so forth. And so it really, when I was in grad school for counseling psychology, there was a part of me that kind of put it in the back of my mind and was studying all the things they were teaching us. But it was also like just kept coming up as like, oh, this is a structure for me to hang all these things on and start making sense of it all.
And how would you say that that you feel like Leary and Wilson both kind of came together on the model, and how do you think they differed? And
Well,
It was Leary's first. And can you give like just a little bit of background on how you think Leary sort of originally designed it, or
well,
why?
so I think Leary being Leary, I want to say he went down to Mexico. I forget the names of the people that he was involved with. Robert Gordon Wasson comes up, but anyway, he went down to Mexico. They invited him down to check out mushrooms with a Mexican native shaman, I guess I'll call it.
Mhm.
And my belief is from that moment forward, he was making models about trying to understand. If you read flashbacks, that's what they were doing. I mean, they were trying to figure out. They were trying to create models to explain these experiences. And as we talked about when we had coffee the other day, there was an essay during the Millbrook years he wrote called "The Seven Tongues of God." It's a pretty lengthy essay, and it doesn't go into the what we might call the circuits in depth. But he basically has like circuits one, two, and three, crude, rudimentary versions of that, and then he skips four, and then he has like six, and then five, and then seven, or no, and then maybe eight. Anyway, yeah. So it jumps around a little. I remember he excludes four, and then he puts six before five, and then yeah, and then there was seven and eight at that time. But it's pretty rudimentary. And then in the John Higgs biography, I Have America Surrounded, Higgs really profiles this interesting part of Leary's life when he was running around Algeria with this guy, Brian Barrett, who was this artist, beatnik, poet type. And they were discussing, uh, you know, I think Leary eventually settled on one, two, three, and four pretty quickly, but the upper circuits were always kind of in discussion about where do you draw the line, how do you order them, that kind of thing. And so he was doing a lot of back and forth with Brian Barrett on that, which is documented in Higgs's biography. And then Leary ended up in prison, and that's where I think he was really corresponding with Wilson a lot. And the Starseed Signals book kind of talks about those times, and a lot of those discussions are like, where do you draw the line between six and seven, and how does it all fit? Um, so to me, info psychology is Leary's book about all that, and to me it reads like Buckminster Fuller on LSD. You take Freud and Fuller and LSD and throw it all in one pot, and out comes info psychology. It was exopsychology originally. Um, and later he and Wilson collaborated on Game of Life. Game of Life is a fun book. To be honest, I'm not a fan. It just takes the let's compare this model to this model to this model just way too far for me. And I think that honestly detracts from the scientific nature of the model. It's like they're trying to make too much of it, but comparing it to the Tarot and the Tree of Life and this and that, and um, I kind of. And then obviously Wilson wrote Prometheus Rising, which became kind of the standard, which really popularized the model. So Leary seemed to be more philosophical. Uh, I'm sorry, I say Leary. Leary was more philosophical. Wilson was kind of popularizing the model, I would say, and writing about it all the time. He slips it into dozens of essays and all dozens of books. So
Mhm.
yeah.
Well, so one question I've always kind of had with the model is like, to correspond or not to correspond. That is the question. Like, it
Mm,
seems like it's almost like nobody has really gotten away from corresponding at least something. Like, I think
yeah.
Wilson in Prometheus Rising does a lot of, he brings in other kind of Freudian and Jungian, and I it seems to me like there's this question of whether to correspond it to other models or not. And it seems like everybody who's written anything on it has at least corresponded something. And
Yeah.
it sort of reminds me of the Kabbalah And like books like Crowley's 777, where there are these huge tables of correspondences, and there's like this almost third circuit need to put things into boxes and show how other models and other frameworks are similar. And I just wanted to know like what your opinion is on the whether to correspond or not to correspond, and is it sort of inherent, and can you even get away from it?
So, um, it- earlier in my youth, I used to really enjoy Wilson and what we'll call isomorphisms and how these models overlap, and I really used to get into that. And lately, I don't care for it at all, and that's just my opinion. So, if I was an expert in the chakra system and I was trying to learn the eight circuit model, I would definitely make correspondences in order to come up the learning curve quicker. But eventually, I think you have to take the model for what it is and appreciate what makes it different from the chakra model. And, I don't see anybody comparing it to the Enneagram model. You can draw some comparisons with astrology, obviously the Tree of Life and the Tarot and the Aleister Crowley Index of Symbols has been done. I mean, that's a lot of what Game of Life is about. Um, and I get it, and I think it again it could be helpful to come up the learning curve, but after that, my interest is like appreciating the model for its uniqueness. So, but that said, my firm belief is that the first, second, third, and fourth circuits are rooted deeply in developmental psychology. They are literally Freudian stages, oral, anal, phallic. He skips the latency period and then goes to the adolescent sexual phase. And and so those are developmental stages that they're talking about that to me are states of consciousness that are always running. So that's what the uniqueness of it maybe from developmental psych is it's like the infant never leaves you. The toddler, there's always an infant running in the background and he's got needs. There's a he, because I'm male, I say that. My toddler is always in the background running needs. My preschooler is there, making models and predictions so he feels safe. My adolescent is wondering how he fits in the tribe. The infant's wondering how safe he feels. The toddler is wondering how secure he is in himself and his emotions, and that's always running. So it's not like it was a stage and then it was done. What the eight circuit model is saying is, hey, these developmental stages are states of consciousness that are going on. Maybe one of them is in the background, or maybe three of them are in the background while one's in the front, or whatever. But that to me, I think needs to be emphasized. And so when I talk about correspondences, to me, it's like let's look at infant development. What are the key things about that inform how we define this first circuit state of consciousness? What do we know about toddler developmental psychology, and how can that inform second stage, and so on and so forth? And then for me, so that's my foundation. The developmental stages inform the lower circuits, and then I don't even think of them as separate. I mean, not everybody embraces the Antero Alli upper lower correspondence. A lot of the old school Wilson Leary people see it still kind of as that progression that Wilson highlights. But for me, I take it a step further from Antero. I see the upper circuits is really at just emergent properties of the lower circuits. It's like the lower circuits are our soul. They're what we bring into this world and what we're formed with. And then these upper circuits are more like the spiritual emergent properties of the lower circuits. And so they're different from each other, but in my mind, they're actually just, circuit 5 is just an extension of circuit 1. And you can look at various pioneers of transpersonal psychology and even like Buddhism and Hinduism and some of the more transpersonal religions and use those states of consciousness that they describe to inform how we define the upper circuits. But to me, it's rooted in the upper is rooted in the lower.
Mm.
So that's just me and my isomorphism with developmental stages. But to me, that's the foundation of the model. It's like that's just what it is. And you mentioned Erickson, or I mentioned Erickson, but you mentioned Jung, and Wilson, I think, actually misinterprets Jung and how he can apply to the model, and he actually misinterprets some of Freud's stages, which kind of shocked me. The more I learned about developmental psychology, the more I questioned Wilson's scholarship, to be frank. But I ran into a book, and it was a student of Jung, Eric Eric Neumann, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking for it if I can see it here on my shelf. And anyway, he tried to summarize Jung. Jung wrote the introduction to the book and said, hey, the pioneer can't really summarize his work because he's too busy pioneering, but this is a summary of my work. And I read that book probably 5 or 6 years ago, and it totally blew me away because he charts the development of myth from indigenous primitives to not primitive, from indigenous folks in earlier times. He charts the development of myth over the ages, and he breaks it up into 4 distinct stages. And then he charts the development of a human over in the 4 distinct stages. And those 4 stages are the 4 circuits. So it was like, oh, this is completely congruent with Jung, and he was looking at mythology. Erik Erikson was a student of Freud, and he came along after, and he kind of took the Freud stages that went through adolescence, and he took them off to adulthood. But where Freud had like a sexual lens for his stages, Erikson had a social lens. And so I also look at what Erikson had to say about 1, 2, 3, and 4, and how that fits. So I feel like I'm rambling here, but.
Well, I had so that sparked like 2 questions that we can go on, and I'll try to remember the second one. So as far as the first 4 circuits, do you feel like from what you've learned, there is sort of post Wilson, Leary, Antero Alli information that we have gathered since they did their main writing on it that you feel like needs to be added? Or that you feel like is important? Yeah. And I know you talk a lot about relational, like always in relationship and how we develop in relationship. Can you talk a little bit about that and the first 4 and how you see that working?
I think that, and I'll just name a few of the things that we've come up with. And Leary actually in Game of Life talked about epigenetics before I don't even know where the hell he got this in the 80s, because it's still kind of an emerging science today. But epigenetics, I believe, is really the science of imprinting. And so I think that's something that hasn't really been explored. When I start looking particularly at the first and second circuits, modern attachment theory, the work of Alan Shore, modern polyvagal theory, the work of Stephen Porges. What else? Just different, what we know about adolescence and what's going on neurologically, to me, is there's a different processes of development going on during adolescence. Instead of the brain wiring up and growing and developing, it's like all the wiring gets insulated, and which is a completely different process than the younger developmental stages. So to me, it's like, well, how does that's interesting. How does that, what's the impact of that? How would that inform the model? So those are some of the other thing, the other modern theory is right and left hemisphere discussions by a guy named Ian McGilchrist. And his big book on that is The Master and Its Emissary, or His Emissary. And I think that really describes what Wilson called the thinker and the prover. And it talks about what I might call first and second circuit right hemisphere stuff versus third circuit left hemisphere stuff, and this dynamic that goes on between those two. Um, to me, that's fascinating, and that I would really like to flesh that out further.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so those are developments that I see that weren't really covered. A lot of it they just didn't know about back then. Maybe the imprinting discussions back then seemed to talk more about the human nervous system, and in my mind, it's really more about epigenetics, and that's
Mm-hmm.
there's an epigenetic imprint basically. So like when the amygdala, which I'll call maybe a representative of the first circuit, when that develops, which is in the womb actually before you're even born, uh, it comes online, it gets developed, and then all of a sudden it comes online. And during that period where it comes online, it takes in its environment, and the environment imprints on it epigenetically. And the epigenetics um, controls which genes are expressed and which aren't. So some genes are expressed and some are like turned off, and that's a factor of the environment at the time of the critical period of activation. And so to me, that's the epigenetic imprint that is more a genetic thing. It all starts with genetic expression. I don't think they knew that back in the 70s and the 80s like they do today. So that's an area where I think there's a lot that can be done there. There was more to your question I wanted to answer, but I've kind of lost my train of thought.
Well, and so the relational aspect then
Ah,
first circuit then you're if you're in utero, you are a part of your mom, like you're one and the same at some and then you when you're born, the relationship between you and mom is super important and strong. Can you talk about how that um
yeah. So, particularly first and second circuit, I believe are all about relationship. Um, Leary, the 70s and the 80s, I think were marked with a lot of behavioral psychology that, like cry it out and stupid shit like that. And I think there was just kind of a psychology of the individual. But now we're learning that development is all relational. And that is when we talk about the environment that's shaping the epigenetic imprint, it's the relationships that are the core of the environment. So your relationship with what, the clinicians would call the primary caregiver shapes how the infant develops. It shapes how the toddler develops. It shapes how they emotionally regulate. So a few years ago, I guess my dad died, and it's been my experience that biological parents, when they pass, it tends to be a pretty big rug pull, and I got the rug pull, and I went in. It really stirred up through some weird set of circumstances, just very primitive, like sense of safety stuff for me. And I went to an old supervisor, teacher of mine, and worked with her in a client therapist relationship. And after our first session, she's like, "So how do you reach out?" And me being the typical guarded, walled male, I was like, "What the fuck do you mean reach out? I don't reach out." And that became so much work. But I mean, so much of my work around what I think is like first, second. Like if you imagine an infant waking up in his crib all alone, does he shut down? Does he cry? What are those things? And what does that look like? And how is he received if he cries and things like that? And that, so particularly at the first and second circuit, I think that has a huge impact, the relationships. And the fourth circuit, I think, is largely social tribal, but also it's also a point where you're kind of moving from a codependent or interdependent relationship with, what's the right word? Codependent. Yeah. I mean, as an infant, you can't exist without your parents, and you're dependent on your parents. And
mhm.
and as you move into adolescence, you start moving from these asymmetric relationships of parent and child to more of a symmetrical interdependent relationship with a romantic partner, and
Mm.
that brings up a whole new set of interactions. Um, so yeah, to the extent I think Leary was a philosopher and Wilson was a popularizer. Antero really brought it deeply into his realm of embodied experience. And to me, then there is just the next step is how are you relating?
Mm.
That embodiment, presence, and relationship are all in a way like one intermingled thing. And how does that affect us?
Hmm.
So yeah, I guess that's my long-winded answer about relationships and
Yeah, I like that. And like third, you had mentioned somewhere in one of the things you had written that Third Circuit has a lot of like projection into the Fourth Circuit judgment. And that what's funny is that, I've witnessed this in my own relationships, is that I think it all melds together. And there are some times where we project what we should have had with our parents onto a partner. I remember there was a conversation I had in high school where it seemed like some of my friends were attracting people that like physically looked like their mom. You know what I mean? They looked like their parent. I had one friend who had a girlfriend who like almost spitting image of his mom. And so there's like some Freudian stuff going on there. But it like the relationship aspect I find super fascinating, and I don't necessarily remember a whole lot of that being talked about in Wilson on Torelli or
mm,
Timothy Leary. There's a lot of like it was almost like you're in a box and you need to work on your
yeah.
circuits, where I love the bringing in the relationship. So the other question I had about, you were talking about circuit 5 through 8 being like almost emerging, like
Hmm.
spiritual emerging properties. Would you say that, I was wondering, like, how do you feel that they emerge? And even do they necessarily emerge depending on someone's experiences? Would you say that there's a chance that they may not emerge, or do you see them as like
Yeah.
fundamentally emerging?
Boy, that's a might be a little above my pay grade, to be honest. I I guess what I'm saying is that I think that Wilson and Leary presented this kind of stair step. We would try to avoid the word hierarchy, but there was a certain amount of hierarchy and progression. And Antro said, "Hey, really, these things are related, and it's not like that." And I'm taking it a step further in a way and saying it's not even so much that I think they're related. I think they're just you know different aspects of each other. Now, in terms of like evolutionary psychology and when did these properties emerge and all that, I'm going to pass on that because I think that's I could bullshit you with an answer, but I would just be bullshitting. I could, we could dig through Prometheus Rising and come up with some of Wilson's stuff, but I think that's largely speculation that's completely unsupported by reality. To be frank, um, yeah,
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's always seemed to me like it's almost like a soup, or it's like a bunch of food. And kids have these like bento boxes where everything, like you put your eggs in here and you put your but really it's like a soup that I think we try to delineate in order to understand more. But sort of what I was getting from you and what I've always sort of intuited is that it's life, and then we try to segment it in order to sort of understand it more. But really it's all a melange. It's all like this, like this soup of things that all have ingredients, but
yeah,
yeah, it's hard to necessarily piece apart, which is why so my next question would be, that's why I like to hear people's stories, and I like to hear people's experiences, because I think that's another way to delineate it. But in more of a real world, less theoretical aspect. So do you have any good stories from like what you might delineate as Circuit 5 through 8 experiences? Like, do you have a favorite Circuit 5 experience or story?
You know, we talked about this ahead of time, and I started like delineating different what I would call non-ordinary experiences, and I had a few different groupings of that. Um, Again, my early college experiences, college year experiences with where I was running around chasing the Grateful Dead. Um, there was something unusual about that band and the way they interacted with each other and the way they interacted with their audience. And it's hard for me to just think about it in terms of story and how do I explain this, but just they tried to keep as little separation as possible between their audience and themselves. That was based on their origin. I know I mentioned the Grateful Dead a lot on this podcast, so I'll just go ahead and say read the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test if you want to learn about them. That's a fun little book. It's a very uncharitable description of the merry pranksters meeting with Kesey that's sort of been debunked, but largely not. But anyway, there's just this exchange of energy that I could feel at those shows. And not only that, like my first shows were outdoor concerts in Las Vegas, and it hardly even gets cloudy in Las Vegas, but yet a storm formed behind the stage, and there was lightning strikes, and the band was playing off the lightning, and it felt like the lightning and the wind was playing off the band. And of course, I had a head full of LSD, so it all blended together. But there just felt like this real Seventh Circuit connectedness of everything. And so that was a large part of my psychedelic experience back in the day. Um, when I went to Naropa, we were doing all kinds of experimental, different modalities of experimental therapy, from Hellinger constellation work to we had like a summer class on yoga and the chakras. I was meditating. We were required to meditate twice or 5 days a week for 20 minutes. Which there's something about requiring people to meditate, even like the seasoned practitioners dropped their practice because the
Mm.
requirement like was just made it distasteful. But at the beginning of the curriculum, everybody was pretty much on board, and I always struggled to separate, to observe my breath. We're practicing Tibetan Buddhist meditation techniques. And it's just to observe the breath without controlling it, basically. And as soon as I start to observe my breath, I start to control it. It's almost inseparable. And I was in this different space that had a really good feel, a little meditation room and a satellite building on campus. And it had a very open, spacious feel. And I was just really deepening into the meditation, and I felt myself let go of the control and just witness my breath. And as that happened, it was like fear just rose up out of my chest, and I was in a cloud of fear. Like by letting go of control, I found myself in this space of fear, and I was walked around in this just shell shocked place of fear for about a week. And it was actually exactly 1 week later because it was this human development course they were taking, and they had a guest speaker. And the speaker back then, 20 years ago, referred to as a transvestite. I think that word is no longer in vogue, but um, it was a he that liked to dress like a she, and was telling his story. And I was just awestruck by this person's courage. And I remember that by the end of that class, listening to that person speak and being awestruck by their courage, my fear had kind of dissipated. And I don't know how to, what circuit does that fall into? I mean, the fear to me is, it was like I was touching into some deep first circuit stuff with some sixth circuit meditation practice. But again, that's kind of like the soup. Like
I
at the
feel
end,
like I heard some like Fifth Circuit stuff coming, and it almost, to me, and we don't have to go into this if you don't want. To me, it sounded like that was like a fifth emerging from a first. Like the way you kind of explained.
I would say, yeah, by the end of the week, when I was witnessing the courage, I was kind of back in my body, and yeah, maybe that listening to the courage brought me into a Fifth Circuit experience after being in just like a rattled First Circuit trauma for a week. Um, and so through all the experiential work at Naropa, every class was like group therapy. And when I say therapy, I mean, we're talking about experiential therapy. And it's not like we're sitting there talking about the past. We're busy experiencing relationship in the moment and the dynamics of that and everything that comes up. And later on with therapy training, Gestalt, I did Gestalt certification training. It was the same stuff. It was all group therapy work, basically. Or we'd work one on one in a group.
Mm.
And we use the group as props. And we'd have kind of psychodynamic work where you're using the group as props to create these experiences of, and, and, um, and then later I started getting involved with the Mankind Project, which does similar things in their own way, a lot of group therapy, a lot of psychodynamic work. So a lot of those different experiences, and that's where a lot of my bias from relationship comes from, is just having those experiences. Also had some experiences with Antero Alli's curriculum with the salt bath, where I felt my consciousness, which is almost always up here, drop into my body. And I was like in my body, conscious. Instead of being conscious up here, I was conscious down here for like a week before it faded. I did the anima ritual a few times with some interesting experiences. When I was in Europe, I did Tai Chi class, and that was a very Sixth Circuit, just these slow, ancient movements really brought me in touch with my energy body. Um, so yeah, just doing all these various things. I kind of sample a lot of different stuff, but I don't really have like a consistent practice with any of it. But except maybe just being in a group and doing group. I don't want to call it therapy work, but group work has been kind of
Hmm.
a long-standing practice for me through various avenues. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I'm a big fan of like exercise stuff. I love that. I love the exercises. That's sort of where I gravitate towards. And so what I think I'd like to do, if you could, is kind of go the route of what you consider metaprogramming to be.
Uh,
Wilson talked a lot about metaprogramming as a Sixth Circuit thing. And then even if you want to touch a little bit on how it seemed like sixth and seventh got a little confused, but what do you feel like metaprogramming is, and would you consider that to be a Sixth Circuit phenomenon?
yes. I think Wilson switched them, and I don't follow this in detail because it doesn't really interest me terribly much, but I know Wilson had metaprogram on seven, and that would be more the neuroelectric, the metaprogrammer versus the neurogenetic, which the connectivity with all things, in my mind, which is a seventh circuit process. Um, but bottom line is, I think the programs are the third circuit. Those are the belief systems, the conceptual models, the third circuit. And that really limits our perspective and limits our view. And it's the meta programming that lets us realize, oh, I've just been in this third circuit tunnel, and I can choose a different tunnel, or I can expand the tunnel or create a labyrinth or whatever it is. And and so in his thinking, and I tend to agree with this, that the meta programmer was related to the metaprogrammer programs the third circuit or opens up the third circuit. And then I think there was kind of, I joke about this in my own head, but where's the metaprogrammer? It's like, where's the clitoris? Pardon my, you know, to be frank, I think it's all metaprogramming. If I'm going to program
Uh,
my first circuit, is that metaprogramming? Well, I'm not really working with conceptual models, so maybe it's not
mm,
programming, but I want to integrate all my circuits, right? So there's a certain amount of work that has to be done on every circuit. But the metaprogrammer, to the extent that it's involved with opening up the third circuit, well, then you could say, well, the third circuit relates to the seventh circuit, so maybe the metaprogrammer needs to fall there. But I think it's really more when you get in touch with your energy body, and which is you drop out of mental space and thinking, and you get into the felt sense space. That's where you realize it's like the observer observing the mental space. So you can
mm,
separate yourself from the mental space and look at it and say, oh, um, this is just a program. So, boys, I'm starting to even question myself as I'm talking through this. Without getting into too much depth, I think the meta programmer is what allows us to open up and reorient the third circuit conceptual models.
mhm,
However, I believe it falls on the sixth circuit. It's like
mhm,
when you drop out of the conceptual world and you can look at it from the sixth circuit world, I can look at the conceptual world. Then I can realize that oh, I can do more here.
mhm,
I can reprogram these conceptual models, but I'm doing it from a separate place. So
mhm.
I guess that makes
Yeah,
sense.
that totally makes sense. I've always seen it as like the sixth can play with 1 through 5 and six,
Mm,
and doesn't necessarily have a lot of creative influence on 7 or 8, but has creative influence on the first 5 as like the dial turner,
yeah.
and the sort of that part of you that's still sort of part of you, but is able to change the channels, and able to get creative.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned imprinting. Do you feel like I hear a lot when I read Wilson and Leary mainly a lot about what would they call re-imprinting. So do you believe there is a possibility to re-imprint, and how does that look?
Um, yeah. I mean, that's the whole show, I think, is the idea that we can change. Uh, when I read Wilson, Leary, and maybe Wilson as well, sometimes I get well, Leary was famous for saying this, you can be anyone this time around. I don't know if I buy that. I like that's a message of optimism and hope, but I think it's more about becoming who we are. And there is some genetic essence that can't be changed, but we can change our epigenetic imprints. And I don't know what the science says about that right now. Um, but I mean, obviously, the psychedelics seem to loosen these imprints and allow for change. The trick is, I think it's more than just having a mind-blowing experience on mushrooms, that you have to really do your work to integrate it. And there's a certain window after the experience where you have to put the behavioral change in place to integrate the experience. Um, Leary would talk, and I guess Wilson would talk about. I get them kind of all blurred in my head. So we talk about shocks, and major. Even like the one that comes to my mind is like giving birth for a female opens up an imprint window.
Mm,
Trauma opens up an imprint window, usually a negative imprint, I guess, because trauma is trauma. But all of these things I was talking about with group therapy and experiential therapy, to me, it brings you into a deeper felt sense experience that allows for imprinting. And I guess maybe as I'm just rambling here, change takes time. How I, especially, I could probably do a big dose of psychedelics and really spend the next week of my life trying to show up differently. But most of my change, I think, has come gradually through learning from these profound experiences and then trying to institute these behaviors in my relationships. And it changes over time. I mean, I've been married for 30 years, I think, 25 or something like that.
Mhm.
And that relationship has probably been one of the most profound evolutionary parts of me, and how I've changed over the years by how I show up, and how we show up together, and how we maybe one of the big things about relationship, and I don't know how this necessarily applies to circuits, but it's like you and I can, or me and my wife, we can put everything into trying to be connected and in relationship at all times. But I'm going to say something stupid inadvertently, and the relationship will break. It's going to happen. There's no fantasy where it's always perfect. You're going to have these ruptures to the relationship. So then it
Mhm.
becomes a matter of identifying the ruptures and repairing them quickly. And that, to me, takes deep work,
Mm,
because you have to repair it, you have to own where you were the idiot.
mm,
You can't, if you're busy blaming the other person because you had this rupture of the relationship, then you're going to go nowhere. You have to take a look at yourself and how you're showing up in relationship, and own it. And that leads to change, but it's a gradual change.
mhm. Yeah, well, and I find that too, and to sort of relate it to the circuits, if one person had, as many needs met as possible as an infant, and another person in the relationship may have had a mother who wasn't there or a father who wasn't there, and maybe even there was a little bit of violence that was witnessed, then as those two people try to relate, they're coming from very different like initial experiences. And so one of the reasons that I like the circuit model is that you can go back as much as possible and realize really where you're coming from, and then maybe try to restore, and maybe try to give yourself something that you may not have gotten. There's the almost like the ability for us to reparent ourselves if we maybe didn't have the greatest parenting experience. And because life is hard, like nobody has the perfect parenting experience, so it's like we all need a little bit. And then, as second circuit, if you had older brothers, or if you were the oldest, that's going to give you a very different outlook on life. And if you're relating to someone who had no siblings and really only ever hung out with their parents, then that would give them a different outlook. And so I think compassionately, we all realize that we came from different places and had different imprints, and that maybe that would um, help us in
Yeah.
our.
So I think it all starts with awareness, and becoming aware of my habits of how I show up in the world. And the more awareness I have around those habits, then I can see, like, oh, I'm doing my thing again. And now that I'm aware that I'm doing my thing, I can choose to show up differently. I can choose to show up more openly, more lovingly, more connectedly. Maybe I'm too merged with this person and I need to separate. Maybe I'm too closed off with this person. I need to open up. But developing an awareness of how we habitually show up in the world, which we all do 99% of the time. And then when it becomes a problem, oh, I'm doing my thing. How can I show
Mhm.
up differently? And by showing up differently and making that deep effort to show up in a, like, say, a more open and loving way, and then being received for that, that creates that, or starts to open up that imprint, starts to
Mhm.
open up that genetic, maybe there's an epigenetic imprint where that gene expression is shut off, and I'm actively working to open it back up, and eventually it'll take hold. And the more you practice those things and the more you do the work that comes up around that, the more you're shifting the imprints.
Hmm. Yeah, I like that. As far as Circuit 8 goes, what that seems to be that one, like everything else, like we can talk about it. And I know that being that every chapter in Prometheus Rising had exercises, and Antero Alli's work is really pretty exercise heavy. Um, if do you have you felt like you've had any kind of Circuit 8 experience? Have you?
Um, I think to make Circuit 8 more accessible, Ontero talked about dream work and things like that. You know, so I guess if we start from the beginning, Circuit 5 to me is like when you really deeply in touch with your body and you feel safe and loved, then you have this experience of somatic bliss. And then Circuit 6 is like you feel really deeply in touch with your nervous system and your energy body. And then you begin have like this Circuit 6, like ecstasy and intuition and things like that. Um, and then Circuit 7 to me is like, okay, I've got this Circuit 6 felt sense skill developed, and then I can start to feel more connected to the things around me and my environment, and deeper connections to the planet and
Mhm.
maybe the cultural archetypal energies and all that good stuff. So it's that sense of connection.
Mm.
And then Circuit 8 is kind of like you're so connected that you kind of completely lose a sense of self, but not just a sense of self, which you might lose in Circuit 7, but you lose a sense beyond space and time. That's the key, I guess, to me, is this non-local, beyond space and time.
Mhm.
Um, and that to me is the most elusive circuit by a long shot. Ontero would talk about out of body experiences, which he had a very profound one. He would talk about dream work, which he was very big into. Um, and he would also say when he ranked his own mastery of the circuits, where he might be anywhere from a 8, 9, 10 out of 10 on all the other circuits, he would rank himself a 5 on the eighth circuit. And so I kind of take my own eighth circuit incompetence with a grain of salt when I see where Onsro placed himself.
Mhm.
And then I don't, I'm just one that I've learned that I just don't dream. I sleep really deeply. Occasionally I dream. So unfortunately that's not really an avenue I can explore for eighth circuit. Maybe I need to do ketamine, I guess. But
Mhm.
um, I can't say I've had a lot of deep eighth circuit experiences.
Yeah, or even DMT. One of the things I read a lot of with the Eighth Circuit relating to what they call DMT experiences is that there are that supposedly you are out of body. I don't know how you would ever prove if you are in body or out of body or what part of you. Um, but that there are other entities that you commune with that are not part of the corporeal world.
Yeah.
Um, Fascinates me, but I don't have a ton of experience with that. And the crazy thing about dreams, and what I do know about the DMT experience is that it's hard to even hold on to. It's like somebody compared it to like putting your thumb on a tomato seed. Like every time you try to get it, it's
Mm.
gone. And so it's really hard to actually like talk about. And so the one thing that I really like the idea about dreaming, and the idea that when we dream, it actually influences our physical body. One of the most like interesting facts I learned once is that they think that children and animals and we like when we dream about motor skills, we're not actually physically doing that, but it actually makes us better. And I don't know why that is, but I've always attributed that to like an eighth circuit thing. Like we
Mm.
dream about whatever it may be. Mice dream about a maze. we dream about running or manipulating things with our fine motor skills, and then when we wake up we're actually better for it. And
Yeah.
I haven't been able to flush out the why. I don't even know if I would ever be able to do that. being that I'm not as
Yeah.
being that I'm not a scientist, I couldn't ever prove that one way or another. But it seems like Antero Alli distinct like has two bodies. He has like Earth body and Dream body, and that there is this really interesting connection that what Dream body does actually influences what Earth body does.
Yeah. I can't really speak with any kind of intelligence or competence on all this. My limited understanding is that dreams help us integrate the previous day's experiences. And from what I'm aware of Antero's work, um, he would take like he would say, remember your dream, and then pick like three movements from that dream, and then you probably know this better than me, but and then you use those movements to kind of create the paratheater non-ordinary experience.
Mm-hmm.
So in that way, you're kind of bringing the dream world into the real world, I guess, or the Earth world. But
Mm-hmm.
I can't really. That's about as far as I could speak to it.
Yeah, and I the only other thing that I found that went through, because I've done a lot of his dream rituals, is that it kind of goes the other way too. When you try to lucid dream, when you do any practice on attempting to lucid dream, though it's so like ephemeral, it's hard to hold on to. um you go throughout your day and you use your hands and you touch things and
Right.
you ask yourself if you're dreaming, and then you confirm that you're not. And this has happened to me once or twice in dream. You'll see your hand, you'll remember that you were doing that, and then you'll wake up in your dream and you'll be able to do stuff. I had an experience where I woke up, I was in a dream. It was this typical, like, I'm naked in my dream. And I looked at my hand and I woke up and I saw a car and I was like, oh, that's Dream Car. And I heard Tool playing and I'm like, oh, that's Dream Tool. And the sky looked really cool. And then I was like, well, shit, I need some clothes. And in my dream, you know what I mean? In my dream, I had like they were in a locker somewhere, like way far away. And I was like, all right, here's a shirt. Okay, here's a shirt. Put a shirt on. Here's some pants. Put some pants on. And so, like, there is that your physical body doing exercises with your physical body helps you remember in dreamland to wake up. And
Mm,
it's so like it's so hard to hold on to and so
yeah.
hard to like make happen, like you can't control it. But it really touches on this very cool connection, I think, that Antero Ali talked a lot about between earth body and dream body. But it's like, yeah, that eighth circuit is always that, you know,
Yeah.
it's up and beyond.
I to boil it down, I just really think of the Eighth Circuit as beyond space time.
Mm-hmm.
And from the Fourth Circuit perspective, if we're connected to our romantic partner and our tribe and our village, and if we're so fully connected, that allows us to then, and if we're so fully connected in our Fourth Circuit, that then allows us to lose ourselves completely beyond space and time in the Eighth Circuit. But again, that's a more of a conceptual way to look at it. It's not necessarily. It's more intuitive to me than rooted in experience.
Mm-hmm. And so then one other question I have would be like, why the eight circuits? Like, is there a why do we do the eight circuits? And what would you tell somebody who didn't know at all
Mm,
if you were like, oh yeah, I'm into the eight circuit model of consciousness, and they were like, well, what the hell is that? Well, it's this thing, and they're like, well, why would you do that? What's the point?
great.
What would you say
Yeah.
to that?
Well, going back to what I said earlier, to me, it provides a meta framework that helps make sense of this fragmented hodgepodge field of psychology. So it helps me understand the human condition from like a multidimensional perspective. Um, it gives me that, it brings in the transpersonal. So, with the psychedelics are becoming legitimate or legitimized through this, psychedelic therapy these days. And people are trying to understand their experiences just the same way Leary did, back in the 50s, the late 50s, early 60s. And so it helps them understand their experience. But then what Antero, I think, really brought to the table with the relationship between upper and lower is like, okay, you've had this powerful psychedelic experience. That's great. Congratulations. So what? Oh, well, here maybe it's exposed some gaps in my lower circuits. So now I can go work on that. Or now that I've worked on the lower circuits, that opens me up to more higher consciousness, upper circuit experiences. So it's a model to understand. I think I want to say consciousness, but I think that word is gotten a little more scientific now, and I don't know that I can necessarily use it this way. Wilson called it 8 dimensions of mind when he taught at the Maybe Logic Academy. He taught the 8 circuits under the title 8 dimensions of mind, and he put mind in quotes, which is a Korzybskian general semantics technique that says we really don't have a clear definition for this. But
Mm-hmm.
because I think science has got a bit more concise definition for consciousness, and it doesn't quite fit what we're doing here. But we can understand the human psyche uh, more. We can understand how we have this toddler living within us running the show, and we have an infant, in us running the show, and there's a preschooler in us making all these models, and there's an adolescent that wants to fit in, and all these things are happening at once. And then we can also work with these non-ordinary experiences and see how they tie into ordinary consciousness and how to make sense of like what, God, I dropped acid the other day and I don't know what the hell happened. My whole world is rocked. Like, well, here's a model that, maybe helps you make sense of all that. But again, maybe the biggest thing is I'm thinking out loud here, but I want to say the idea that humans could change, particularly in Leary's time, was pretty taboo. And the whole idea around this model is, hey, we do change, and this is because of imprints, and we can re-imprint, and that's change. So how can we grow, develop, and mature as human beings, and expand to higher consciousness and expand into lower consciousness and
Mm.
um, my fascination has long been more with the lower four than the upper, and almost to a fault. And I think that when I read Wilson, maybe there's a little bit too much emphasis on the upper. And
Mm-hmm.
like, Wilson would say, the lower second circuit is just territorial grunting signals. And like, well, that's true. And there's more to it than that, and it's just not something that to be dismissed. It's
Mm.
something to be integrated like all the others.
Yeah, so it's kind of a two-parter, almost because we're getting on an hour here. What haven't we touched on in this conversation that you'd like to, or where would you like to see the model go from here?
Well, we had shared kind of some questions. So there's a couple things I'll touch on that we didn't cover, and then remind me to where would I like to go from here. The Professor Adams story. So I think there's a whole generation where Wilson passed away 20 years ago, and Antero kind of took the flag, so to speak, and ran with it, and was teaching classes at the Maybe Logic Academy and then on his own. And he always told the Professor Adams story. And I think we have a whole new generation that has been raised, so to speak, on this Professor Adams story. And so I'm here to say emphatically the Professor Adams story is complete bullshit. Um, and I called Antero on this 20 years ago when he first started teaching it. I was like, that story is complete bullshit, right? And he DM me back, and he just said, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. So the Professor Adams story is documented in What Does Woman, well, it's not going to show up, my
Oh
copy
yeah.
of What Does Woman Want, which I think has a
Mm-hmm.
couple of timelines and going on at once. And one of them is the Professor Adams timeline. And I usually just end up reading that and skipping the rest of it. It
Mm-hmm.
is fairly entertaining, but the idea is that when he was at Millbrook, there was all kinds of people coming through Millbrook. He got kicked out of Harvard with Alpert and Metzner, and they landed at this Hitchcock estate that the Hitchcock family or Peggy Hitchcock had said, "Here, you can use my place to hang out." It was this huge estate, I think several hundred acres. It was a mansion and guest houses, and they used it to do psychedelic research. And so there's all kinds of people coming in and out of there, and the way the Professor Adams story is like this Western professor that was trained in tantric methods, I think, just showed up and slowly revealed this ancient 24 stage, eight stages and three or whatever it is. There's the 8 circuits, but each circuit has 3 stages, so you get 24. And he slowly revealed these 24 stages over time, and that's the history of the 8 circuit model. Is some dude just showed up and dropped it in Leary's lap? No, we talked about the history earlier in the podcast and how it developed over time with Brian Barrett and with Robert Anton Wilson and correspondence. And um, so it's a fun story, and it's a little cringe to me because it really takes away from what I think was Leary's hard work in developing the model. It's very original
Mm-hmm.
to him, I think, and he put a lot into it. It wasn't like some dude just showed up one day and dropped it in his lap. And all you have to do is read Seven Tongues of God, which was written in Millbrook, and realize that it has got hardly any relation to the 8 circuit model we know today. Um, so there's that. The other thing you wanted to ask me about is Dewey Freeman's Gestalt questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
So I'll go into that a little bit because I think that is really a great way to break down some of the lower circuit stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so Gestalt is a very fragmented therapy modality. One, it was primarily developed by Fritz Perls, and he started out in New York, and he kind of migrated to Chicago, I think, and then out to the West Coast. And so there's different versions of Gestalt, basically, depending on where he was in the journey. There's like East Coast Gestalt and West Coast Gestalt, and Gestaltists are almost like Discordians. They must stick apart. So Dewey uh, is the founder of the Gestalt Institute of the Rockies, where I trained here in Golden, Colorado, and he was very influential at Naropa, and in that transpersonal psychology program I took. He was one of the founding people, and he had his own. It was really the same as Erickson and the same as Freud's models, but he would not own up to that. So for the first circuit, Freud's oral stage, I think for Erickson it's like versus mistrust. But
Mm-hmm.
for Dewey is like, is the world okay?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what the infant is asking: is the world okay? And the infant has no sense of self, so he's just concerned with the world. Is the world okay? Um, and then for the toddler, it would be, am I okay? And so he just had these simple questions that outline these stages. For the what we call the fourth circuit, his question was, "Who am I?" Um, and and so that Gestalt, like the 8 circuit model, was like recognize that these developmental stages show up as states of consciousness. And the whole idea is that if I'm working with somebody as a therapist in a deep experiential way, they might drop into their infant, and I could see that really what they're saying non-verbally is, am I, or is the world okay, or am I okay?
Mm-hmm.
And so we're tracking, as Gestalt therapists, we're tracking that. And so in a way, he's using these lower circuits without knowing it, or just using the questions. I mean, and primarily as a therapist, we'd focus on, am I okay? You know, 1 and 2. Am I okay? And is the world okay? So that's really what those are about. It, the what we call the third circuit, and then the latency period, he had different things like how much can I do and how well could I do it. And I try to see where those fit into the 8 circuit model, but I think what the 8 circuit model recognizes around the third circuit is the trappings of language and conceptual models that Erickson didn't really catch. And so you bring in that general semantics, you bring in that Robert Anton Wilson reality tunnel perspective, or belief system perspective, and it's a different spin on those developmental stages that you don't really see with Freud and Erickson necessarily. Actually, I think Freud captures it because he calls the third circuit the phallic stage. And if you think about the reason I say he captures is because the phallus is a symbol. So he's in that symbolic mode. He's talking about symbolic consciousness. Maybe.
That's interesting. I never thought about that. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. So it really, again, I really get into looking at what Freud, Jung, Erickson, what's the latest in developmental psychology. If we take these distinct developmental stages and look at them as states of consciousness, what do we know about developmental psychology that can inform our definition of these? And Dewey's questions of, is the world okay and am I okay? I mean, that's a fantastic way to summarize the first and second circuit. And I liked Antero's, what is your role in the village? That's a fantastic way to summarize the fourth circuit. And you pair that with Dewey's, who am I, or who am I really? That's a fantastic way to summarize the fourth circuit into something quick and easy.
Yeah. What is Gestalt? Sorry if it's a rabbit hole you don't want to go down, but I the first time I'd ever even heard of Gestalt therapy was from Robert Anton Wilson. He had mentioned it somewhere. I can't remember where.
Yeah.
But what if you could say like what a Gestalt is? Like what does that word even mean?
So the word is German, and there was a Gestalt perceptual psychologists that predated all this. And so that picture where if you look at it one way, it's like an old lady and an old crone. And if you look at it the other way, it was a beautiful woman. That was kind of a quick and easy way to explain Gestalt perceptual psychology. That depending on what frame of mind you're in, or what your perspective is, that show up how you're looking at things. But and that's the basic where the word came from. And Gestalt, I think, means whole. Like, how do you perceive the whole? All that said, essentially and Fritz Perls is the founder, but the main book he wrote with 2 other guys, but he really was the kind of the figurehead for the whole thing, and he continued to really work with it and evolve it. Essentially, it's what I've been talking about, where it's experiential therapy. It's like foundational to all experiential therapy, versus Freudian psychoanalysis, or what's now called psychodynamic, is more about talking about experience, whereas experiential therapy is more like getting into the experience. A lot of it is just dealing with what comes up between you and your therapist in the room. Or if you're bitching about somebody else in your life, it's like, okay, let's bring them into the room. Now have a dialogue with them here in the present moment. Tell them what you want to say. They're not really here. You can say whatever you want, let it loose, quit holding back. And then the fun part is like, okay, now that you got that out of your system, switch places, be the other person and respond.
Mm.
because everything that just got said is loaded with projection. And when you switch places, then that projection just collapses. And you're like,
Mm.
suddenly you're like, oh shit, it just totally shifts your experience because you realize that everything you just said was all projection and bullshit. That's one example, but the gist of it is that it's what Dewey would say was make contact. As a therapist, I need to make contact. I need to be available to make contact. And then contact over time leads to connection. Connection
Mm.
over time leads to relationship. Relationship over time leads to intimacy. And that's
Mhm.
not sexual intimacy, it's just the intimacy of two human beings in a shared, deep emotional space together.
Mm.
And all this goes back to if you get hurt in a relationship, you can heal through relationship. So you're using the relationship because all of
Mm.
this when you get hurt in relationship, you develop some pattern on how you show up, and it's going to keep showing up, and then it's going to get in your way, and
Mm.
so it gets in my way in relating to you at coffee, and then I have to go,
Mm.
oh, I'm showing up in that dysfunctional way, and what if I, and I broke relationship with Zack, and now if I, gather my wits together, what happened there, and hey, sorry, I was acting out in this way, and this is what's up for me, and this is what my behavior's been, and
Mm.
here's my experience. um, so that's a long-winded way of just saying Gestalt is kind of, there's a lot of experiential therapies out there nowadays. Hakomi is another one that I'm very fond of, and a lot of the somatic experiencing and sensory motor
Mhm.
psychotherapy is a spin-off of Hakomi. But at the end of the day, it's all rooted in Gestalt and how do you make contact and how do you be in relationship and how do you notice when you fall out of relationship and repair that, and how
Mhm.
can you invite the other person into relationship, or those sort of things.
Yeah, that actually hits home pretty strong. I've been reading the book. I don't know if you're familiar with it. How the Body Keeps Score,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, and he goes a lot into polyvagal theory and very similar therapeutic techniques that are sort of less about talking and more about like moving and
Exactly.
that book has really hit me. And then I don't just to see if you've read this, there's a woman named Lisa Feldman Barrett who has a book called
Mm,
How Emotions Are Made. That to me, that one, she got hers aligns very well with the eighth circuit thing. She says you're always working with a body budget.
yeah.
And then the affect kind of comes after that, and then the
Yes.
larger vocab, if you have like 1,000 words for emotions, you'll sort of be better off to gloss over it a little bit. You'll be better off than if you only had 1 or 2 words for emotions. And she
Mm.
makes this sort of pedantic critique on the movie Inside Out
Oh,
about how,
nice.
about how, yeah, like there's not these little dudes living inside you that are anger, that if you had like 5 different words for the different nuances of what could be called anger, you're better off and you're more
Yeah.
diverse than if you just like, I have anger, I have embarrassment, and
I think
her
she's
work,
got a, go ahead.
yeah, her work has really kind of like helped me in a very similar like new way, because she's a very sort of new, she's like very current. um
Yes, I have not gone deep into her work. I've listened to her on a couple podcasts, and the main takeaway I got from my surface level survey of what she had to say, at least the parts that I listened to, was that a lot of what we're calling emotions are actually our third circuit concept of emotions, and that you really need to get below that because that's not emotion. You have to get below that to the felt sense experience of the emotion.
Mhm.
So that really helped me out. Like, oh, half of what we're talking about when we talk about emotions, we're just playing in the third circuit conceptual realm, and that we really need to drop deeper into the felt sense realm and shed some of these conceptual models and really feel and listen. I don't know if that's
Hmm.
completely congruent with her work, but that's part of what I took away, just my brief listening to her talk. So she's, I think, definitely worth uh, listening to further.
Hmm. So like kind of to wrap up, unless you had something else you wanted to talk about, are you are working on anything eight circuit model base that you're gonna put out anytime soon?
So I think I've expressed some original ideas around the model today and talked about some of the modern theories like epigenetics and attachment theory and polyvagal theory and Ian McGilchrist's master and his emissary, the left right brain differences, um, and the relational context. That to me is really moving the model forward, and I'm slow. I'd love to write a book. And part of what I'm noticing as I go down this path very slowly, and I've done, we're doing this today, and I've written a few things here and there, and I've done some video series on my YouTube channel where I'm trying to talk about things. Um, I'm working my way up to that, this relational context with modern science, showing more of what I believe is a more of a direct relationship between the upper and lower circuits. I guess, yeah, what I was going to say is as I develop that and as I start to dip into expressing myself through this and other things, I learn all my shortcomings. Like, oh, I haven't got my head wrapped around that first circuit because I haven't done my work there. I
Hmm.
mentioned some work I was doing with my therapist where she said, "How do you reach out?" I spent a year in therapy with her 2 years ago, and that really shaped a lot of how I view the first circuit, which I thought was one of the most simple and straightforward circuits. And suddenly I've kind of reshaped it.
Mm.
And lately, on the heels of that, more second circuit stuff has come up. So I guess what I'm saying is the more I try to express myself, the more I realize that I need to do a little bit more of my own work. I think I feel pretty solid on the third circuit, but then going to the fourth gets a little sketchy,
Mm.
and a lot of the upper stuff I just need to talk about more. But
Hmm.
as I move, I would love to put together something more comprehensive and thorough on the relational approach to the eighth circuit model with all the modern polyvagal attachment stuff and get that out into the world. And it'll happen someday.
Well, one of the things I enjoyed, and it's cool that we can do multimedia stuff. I don't think the that it was you were able to do it in Antero Alli and Wilson and Leary's day. Is that you have like the meditations in your videos, and I would
Yeah.
almost think like those would go along really well with some writing. Like if you know what I mean, you can almost put out writing in book form, but also put out like video series of some of like the meditations that you were putting out there because I thought those were cool and kind of a cool way to in your own like if I'm listening to it then in my own life I'm sort of like re-experiencing it or going through almost like a path working. I'm going through the circuit and then things are coming up for me based on what you're saying. That
Yeah.
multimedia thing is kind of cool thing we can do these days, I guess.
No, thanks for that reminder because I just did a couple of those meditations and I kind of dropped it, but I definitely got the sense that I was able to communicate the experience of the first and fifth circuit the way I wanted to communicate it through the guided meditation
Mm,
much better than just talking about it. And part of the thing was I was doing like this, like I'm much more comfortable talking to you than I am just talking it to the camera.
mm,
So it would be nice to maybe continue this dialogue further, and talk on the more theoretical, conceptual level, but also really putting an effort into making a series of guided meditations, like you suggested,
Mm-hmm.
to really create that experience that I want to create to help bring you into this. This is what I believe the experience of the circuit is. I can tell you
Mm-hmm.
about it. I can talk to you about the third circuit and Jungian separation of the world parents. And what the fuck does that really even mean? But let me do a meditation. That'll make more sense.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Yeah, well, that's all I have as far as like questions. I really enjoyed this conversation. It's one of my obsessions, and so I like talking about it as much as I possibly can. And so yeah, I would love to continue and do more if that's a part of something you're into.
Yeah, no, I think we release this as a Hilaritas podcast next month, and I'm really appreciative of you giving me the opportunity to talk about from instead of just being the host, I could talk about my thing, and yeah, to be continued.
Yeah, love it. Well, thank you so much.
All right, all right, all right. Thank you for listening. Thank you to Zack for sitting in as host. And thank you, as always, to Christina Pearson of the Robert Anton Wilson Trust and Richard Rasa of Hilaritas Press. This is Mike Gathers signing off with love and cheerfulness. Amor et Hilaritas.